Every New Mexican deserves to understand how the law works for them, or why it doesn't work for them. Welcome to New Mexico Legal Lowdown, hosted by attorney Feliz Rael. Each episode, we will help demystify the legal system and uncover misconceptions through real conversations with New Mexico trial lawyers. Produced and powered by LawPods.
This episode is brought to you by the New Mexico Trial Lawyers Association Alliance for Justice. We want to thank our La Justicia Circle supporters, Singleton Schreiber, Nick Rowley, Lori Benko, Sherry LaCour, and McGinn, Montoya, Love, Curry, and Sievers, PA. Through their generous investments, they're safeguarding New Mexicans' right to access justice and a jury. And now, on to our conversation. Hi, welcome to the New Mexico Legal Lowdown podcast. We are trial lawyers or plaintiff lawyers talking about the civil justice system in New Mexico. The laws in New Mexico may be different from the laws in other states. The purpose of the podcast is to provide general information and to demystify the civil legal process in New Mexico. This is not a substitute for appropriate legal advice in any individual case. Please contact a lawyer if you want to talk about your particular case. And it's also worthwhile to note that for this particular conversation, we are recording before the 2026 legislative session. The laws may have changed because we're talking about a subject that a lot of our legislators are also talking about. But with that caveat, I think that it's still really important to have this conversation because things might still be the same, and also because this provides a little bit of background. I love this, and I love the idea of the Trial Lawyers Organization really making a bigger effort to demystify lawsuits and the civil justice system for ordinary people. I attended a town hall meeting regarding legal issues maybe a couple weeks ago, and the friend that I went with, she had to go to the bathroom, and so I was just milling about listening, and I was just shocked at some of the things that people were saying about had to do with their perceptions about how the legal system worked. And I thought, oh my gosh, people really don't understand.
We represent people who have had often catastrophic things happen in their lives. They've lost a loved one. The government in some way, maybe in civil rights issues, has, crushed them and their rights and put them in, or we're dealing now with, family members kind of disappearing, being detained. I was reading this morning a violinist, a really famous violinist from Utah who had come when he was a child here and part of the Dreamers thing. His father immigrated here through a visa and I guess overstayed. And so this is all he's known for the last 35 years. He grew up in the States. He was educated in the States, went to university, is a very accomplished violinist. And he took a trip to Colorado next door from Utah and
didn't even cross state or international lines.
Right, yeah. I took a trip to Colorado, and his wife got a text saying, honey, I'm being detained by ICE. They're taking me away to a detention center. I don't know where. And it says something like, my God, I can't believe what's happening.
Goodness.
And that's it. We're going through this time right now that's very unusual for us in this country where family members are kind of taken away, rights are being questioned or quashed entirely. And I really believe that society is looking for someone to stand up and say, who is going to stop this or slow this down? Who's going to be there for me? Who's going to be there for my family? And if somebody asked me what trial lawyers do, I would say, we are the who that's going to be there for you.
Yeah.
We're going to be the ones that fight for you and stand up for your rights and stand up for your loved one, whether it was through medical malpractice or a civil rights violation or criminal charges, anything like that. Is this we come in to try to help. And that's at a macro level what we do. Yeah. And we all have our own little specialties that we do it within, because as you said earlier, it gets super complicated. They call it practicing for a reason. I've been practicing since 2006 and I still haven't perfected it. We're still always learning. And so, no, it is very complicated. And I think this is a great idea for us to be able to kind of relate and show the public is who we are, and we're people just like you. We're not in some castle somewhere plotting to harm anybody. We're there. We're in our homes. We're in our communities trying to help you.
Right. I love that. Do you do exclusively medical malpractice right now?
Yeah, so just briefly, and thank you, by the way, for inviting me on here. I think this is really nice to be here. We've known each other for a few years, and I just think the world of you. And um,
Likewise.
so I'm originally from Albuquerque, born and raised here. Went to school in Albuquerque and Las Vegas, New Mexico. My parents lived in different places in the state. I'm married to a nurse. I have three beautiful kids, one who's in college right now, one who will be in college next year. And after I went to law school in Texas, I moved back to New Mexico because I really wanted to try to find a way to help the people in New Mexico through the practice of law, And I just kind of, out of some fortuitous situation, ended up connecting with a gentleman who's no longer with us, but he was a medical doctor. He was a medical doctor who was specialized in pathology, and he was a lawyer. And
One of those rare
yeah, yeah. So he had an
I had a
MD and a
couple in my law
JD.
school class.
Yeah, and he practiced as a pathologist for years and years. And he told me his story briefly was that, he went to practice as a pathologist doing autopsies and causes of death. And he went to law school because he got tired of seeing so many people die because of malpractice. And oftentimes, because of how the system was, I'm not trying to say people were being malicious to try to cover it up, but oftentimes because of how the system worked, family members never knew why they died or that it was malpractice. And so he
Right.
said, I'm going to law school and I'm going to take this on. And that's what he did. So we met and he said, come work with me and I'll teach you everything you need to know about medicine and the law. And that was a good decision because I come from a family of, like I said, my wife's a nurse. My stepfather was an internal medicine physician who practiced medicine in San Miguel for years. His name was Dr. Canode. My father-in-law is finally, he's retired. He practiced emergency medicine in Texas for decades. So I know what it's like to live around healthcare providers. My daughter's trying to get into nursing school right now. So we have issues in this state, Felice, concerning providers as we do across the country. I think where things are coming is that I think what's being narrative to the public is this is about lawyers against doctors. And the reality is, and I hope we can dive into that, is this is really about billion-dollar insurance companies against patients and their rights. That's what this is
Right.
about.
And tiny bit about my perspective is I focus my practice on elderly and disabled people, but there's kind of a broad spectrum of what I do within that area. And I have handled malpractice cases. I generally shy away from them unless it's something that makes sense to me. I'm more likely to say, call my friend or colleague or whatever, unless it just seems so incredibly straightforward. And I learned the hard way. I had a malpractice case years ago when I was first kind of on my own as a lawyer, as a solo practitioner, and I took it to trial and I lost. And I felt bad for a long time because I just really believed in my client. He had a really awful thing happen to him, and the jury just found in favor of the doctor, and it's okay. But I just thought, oh my gosh, this is so hard. I need to take a break from that for a while. So I do other kinds of cases too, but one of the things in my role now in the organization, I've been having a lot of conversations with people, just different people and policies, and I've been quoted in the newspaper and stuff. But one of the things that just is amazing to me is that I don't actually think that doctors and lawyers are as adverse to each other as a lot of members of the public would think. And I think a lot of what's driving the public to have that perception is this idea that lawyers and the medical malpractice cases that they file are causing doctors to leave. And
Mm.
the reason it's causing doctors to leave is because the narrative is that it's increasing their malpractice premiums. What's your insight to that?
Well, first of all, I don't agree with that. And I tell you, I've looked at the data that we have available. What's interesting is that A lot of my colleagues, a lot of elected officials have heard this narrative and they have asked, show me that data, show me that is what's being driven. And we're not getting that information. What we're getting is clear as mud, and we'll get back to you or we'll find this. And, it's a lot of it so far has been anecdotal. And I told you earlier as we started, I went to undergraduate school and law school in Texas. I went to law school in Houston. And when I was in law school in Houston in 2003, my 1L year, my first year, the insurance companies in Texas started this narrative that we're hearing now in New Mexico. Here we are 20 some years later. And you can look it up on Google. The wonderful thing about Google is that we can go back in time and see what happened. In 2003, the narrative was greedy patients, nuclear verdicts, trial lawyers are causing Texas to have a doctor shortage. Doctors are leaving Texas. The premiums are so high. I mean, it's the same thing we're hearing now. It's just they were just saying Texas for New Mexico. Just, replace those. But you've got to pass caps. Now, as you know, Felice, we have caps in New Mexico. We've had caps since 1976. That's something that we don't hear often in the public narrative, that when they're saying we have to cap, we do have caps. I'll come back to that. But in Texas, that was the narrative. You're losing doctors. You're not able to see your doctor because of this. And so the legislature said, well, we're going to pass caps. But they had to do something to do it. And this is so important because at the end of the day, it comes back to your constitutional rights. In Texas, just like every state and our national constitution, there's a constitutional right to a trial by jury. And the jury has basically the power to decide damages. They review all the evidence, and the jurors are made up from people in our communities, and they come together and they look at this evidence and they come back with their verdict. In your case, you said they came back for the doctor. That's what the jurors are for.
And in most cases, right? Isn't that what the data shows?
Yeah, in most cases they do.
The doctors win.
Yeah, that's what the jurors are for.
If it goes to trial.
And so in Texas, they said, we got to amend the Constitution to put caps in place because that's how sacred your right to a jury trial is. They actually had to amend the Constitution in Texas. So they set it up for a vote on the Saturday after Labor Day weekend, and when they knew nobody would turn up to vote. And it barely passed. It was like 51 to 49, whatever. And then they passed the caps. The caps in Texas effectively eliminated medical malpractice. That was it. You can technically still bring medical malpractice cases in Texas. They're basically capped out of existence. That was in 2003. Last month, or earlier this month, I've read probably 3 or 4 Texas papers. The Dallas Morning News, I think WFAA, another one's the Texas Standard, talking about rural hospitals in Texas closing and people not being able to get health care in rural Texas. Now, how can that be if we're told back then that medical malpractice was the cause of this, and they eliminated medical malpractice 20 years ago, but they're still having problems? Because the problem isn't malpractice lawsuits. The problem is, we know from the data, there's a nationwide shortage of healthcare providers across the country. Tennessee has lost 370 physicians in a span of time. Rural hospitals are closing. The articles that I read about Texas hospitals closing is that people aren't getting care in rural hospitals. They're not going there for deliveries as much anymore. They're doing scheduled deliveries in urban areas. They've got more specialty care provided in urban areas, the bigger cities, Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio. So those rural hospitals are suffering. Let's look to Albuquerque and the rest of rural New Mexico. We have Presbyterian, we have Lovelace and Santa Fe, St. Vincent's. You get down to the rural areas, what do we hear? Rural hospitals are struggling because they're closing, they're not getting as much Medicaid reimbursement. So financially, they're having a problem. But the insurance companies here today, these are billion-dollar insurance companies, see an opportunity. They see the same opportunity they saw 20 years ago in Texas. If we change the narrative and make this about bad trial lawyers against good doctors, we can move to get things capped. Because at the end of the day, the people who benefit from caps are the insurance companies. They don't have anything to worry about.
Do we have any insights? It seemed to me that, I know you probably followed the last legislative session a little closer than I did, but wasn't there a proposal to try to collect data from the insurance companies to figure out, just do a better job so we would have data to track the premiums and what was influencing the establishment of those premiums? Do you remember that?
Yeah, there was an attempt. There's been a push to do that repeatedly to try to get the information. Like I said, the insurance companies, not surprisingly, not really forthcoming with that information. And one of the things that we have seen is that premiums have gone up. But in New Mexico, we have the state superintendent of insurance who kind of manages all insurance issues. This is homeowners, this is fire, flooding insurance, malpractice insurance, all that stuff. When we entered into this compromise about medical malpractice in 2021, for the listeners out there, remember this act was passed in 1976, and back then it was like 400,000, I think, for the total amount you could get. Okay. In 1992, I was in high school. They raised it from 400,000 to 600,000. When I say 600,000, that's the cap. It's a hard cap that says it doesn't matter how much you were making, it doesn't matter how young you were, it doesn't matter how many dependents you had. If you died or you're injured somehow, the most you would ever recover is 600,000. Okay. That's just not just after, 35 years. And so in 2021, everybody, the trial lawyers, the medical society, the hospital association, the nurses association, during the legislative session came together and came up with this compromise. And the compromise was, let's raise the caps in two different ways. First is doctors from 600,000 to 750,000. Okay, so the compromise was doctors, individual physicians and their practices would be raised to 750,000 cap from 600,000. The other was the hospitals, and the hospitals agreed to this. This was their compromise. They said, let's raise the cap from 600,000 for hospitals to a graded cap, which would be from like 2022, 4 million. And then every year it goes up $500,000 to in 2027, or actually this year it caps out at like 5 million. That's it. So there are caps at 5 million for hospitals. Well, what does that mean? That means multi-billion-dollar corporations that own these hospitals and run them, they will never have to worry about getting hit for more than what we call compensatory damages, $5 million. That's the cap. Okay. And
That raises an interesting question. I'm going to ask you about punitive damages, but I'm going to let you finish talking first.
yeah, so what we did was when the hospitals, they were going to get out of this capped fund, they still wanted the caps, but they didn't want to be in this this insurance fund anymore. They didn't want to be in that. And what we knew from the legislative sessions is that the fund had been kind of bled dry because of mismanagement. And I think there was a lot of finger pointing as to who's responsible for that. And that's probably for another podcast. But the bottom line was the fund was running in the red.
Because the way it works is that the hospitals and doctors that are part of the system, and we're not talking about UNM, we're not talking about any government related hospitals, but private hospitals and private doctors that are part of this, that opt into this system, and they can opt out. But my understanding of the way it works, and you do more of this than I do, but that they pay for insurance, and the insurance is really just for that first 200,000, right? Because after that, the patient compensation fund picks up the rest, including future medical care.
Yeah, that's
If
right.
it's related. Yeah.
And you again go back to your point, legal stuff is really complicated, and it is very complicated here. So with the way the system works now is that if you're a hospital or a doctor and you participate in this fund, your insurance company pays up to the first 250,000 of those caps. Okay. Then after that, the fund pays a certain amount. And then after that threshold is met, then it goes back to the hospital insurance company to pay the difference for the cap. Okay.
How does a medical provider, whether it's a hospital or a private clinic or just a private doctor, how do they become part of this system that involves the patient compensation fund? Is it just open
Yes.
to anyone?
It's basically a state-run insurance pool is
Yeah.
basically the easiest way to describe it. And they have to submit an application and they basically provide general information about them. And that process, by the way, Felice, has been a little secretive too. They haven't really come forward with what information they're collecting to determine risk. And the analogy I can give to anybody out there who has insurance on their cars is if you get into a lot of car accidents, what do we know is going to happen? Your insurance company is going to say you're high risk and we're going to raise your premiums, or they might just drop you entirely. They look at the risk. And so what they look at it with a hospital or anyone who's applying to the fund, and as you said earlier, it's not required. You don't have to participate in the fund. It's all you can do it by choice.
But the benefit is that over the past several years, taxpayer dollars have sort of bolstered that
Yeah,
fund.
yeah. And so the fund wasn't taking in a proper evaluation of risk for these hospitals. These hospitals make billions of dollars. So what they were doing was the hospitals were getting kind of a sweet deal. They were buying into the fund. They were getting caps at the $600,000, but they weren't really paying their fair share. They
Yeah.
weren't really paying for their risk. And so
Because the
that's what,
fund was paying out more
right.
than they were paying in.
Exactly. The fund was paying out more than they were taking in. And in any business, if you're paying out more than you're taking in, you're going to have a financial problem. And that's
Yeah.
where it led to the legislator had to bail them out. Well, I think we're to the tune now of $75 million that they have bailed this fund out. Well,
Wow.
these billion-dollar hospitals have benefited from not paying their fair share.
Who actually makes that payment into the fund to be part of the fund or to be eligible for to participate in the fund? Does that come from the providers directly, or does the insurance company make that payment on their behalf?
It comes from the providers through the insurance company, and then from the insurance company to the fund. And because of that, we're not really able to
Provider,
find out.
insurance
Yeah,
company, fund.
yeah,
Okay. So
yeah.
do the providers even know how much the fund is paying on their behalf?
They don't really know, as far as I know. And in fact, the only ones who really know how much is being paid on their behalf are the insurance companies. And they're basically telling the public, just take our word for it. We're paying a lot.
Yeah.
Just take our word for it. And anybody who's dealt with an insurance company knows when an insurance company says, just take our word for it, better be careful. But so
Yes.
they bled this dry. The legislature had to bail them out. And then when we had this compromise in 2021 where the hospitals wanted to get out, the superintendent said, wait a minute. You hospitals can't just leave this mess. You've bled this thing dry, and now you want to leave. So there was another part of this compromise that's very important. The hospitals agreed over the next 5 years, between 2022 and 2027, they would pay back these deficits they created or helped create. Okay. We're talking tens of $1 million in deficits. Well, they didn't pay it back directly. Over the course of this time, they've been paying it back, but from what I understand, they've been paying it through their insurance companies. So when an insurance company sends them a bill and says, pay this amount, that includes their premiums plus this payback amount that they're promised to pay back. And it shows an increase in premiums. It shows a 54% increase. But we're not able to tell based off of that what is for the payback amount that they help create and what is actually for the premiums. So it's a little misleading to the public when they say our premiums have skyrocketed because of medical malpractice, when their premiums have gone up, but we know the vast majority of those premium increases have been due to them paying back what they helped create with this deficit.
And so, okay, here's another question. We know that the hospitals pay, and let's see if we can break this down. So UNM, that and the provider, UNM related providers, they're on their own system. They're subject to the Tort Claims Act, which is capped way lower. This doesn't pertain to any federal agencies or, like IHS or anything like that. What we're talking about is private hospitals, but private hospitals pay for the malpractice insurance for their own people. So the doctors that actually work for like Presbyterian or Lovelace, they're not having to write a check for malpractice premiums. Their employer does that for them. And so what we're really talking about in terms of the people who are super affected as well, the hospitals, sure, they have their lobbyists, but the smaller clinic, I think we're worried about that, right? Do we know whether their premiums have gone up, and what do we know about that? And I'll tell you why I'm asking, because at this meeting that I attended, there were several representatives there, and representatives said, show me your malpractice premium statements. I want to see them. And this lady who was, I guess, the head of a clinic said, I already provided you. And the representative said, no, you didn't provide that. What do we know? And I'm sure there are people that know more, but what do we know about what's happening with the clinics and the independent doctors and their premiums? Are they going up? And do we have sufficient information, basically?
The short answer is we don't have sufficient information. And I don't mean to suggest that the doctors are being dishonest. I think what's happening here is that, like I said, I think both sides are being played by one big party, and that's these insurance companies. I think doctors are being told to pay a certain amount and not really being told why this amount or what it's covering. And I think that the insurance companies like to say, well, it's because of medical malpractice lawsuits. So, no, the short answer is we don't have all the information concerning what doctors' policies, but you're exactly right. In 1976, when this law was passed, the act that capped everything, they were addressing a doctor shortage issue. That's what they were
Yeah.
saying, it's a doctor shortage issue. We can debate whether that was the real reason at the time. Regardless, everyone agrees that that act in 1976 and all through the 80s and the 90s was never intended to shield billion-dollar hospital corporations from liability. It was really meant for individual mom-and-pop clinics and doctors, because back then 80% of the physicians in New Mexico were independently run physician practices. Now it's 20%. 20% are independent. All the rest, the other 80, they work for hospital corporations where the hospitals pay their premiums, where they tell them, here's when you're going to work, here's where your hours are, here's what we expect, how many patients for you to see. It has really devolved from the purpose of that original act into now it's turned into hospitals and insurance companies see it as a way to shield billion-dollar corporations. That's not what this act was for. And what we see now is a lot of, I think, per capita, New Mexico has one of the highest private equity owned hospitals. I mean, more private equity companies own hospitals in New Mexico per capita than any other state. Okay.
That's an interesting and concerning thing that we're seeing is the idea of private equity buying up the smaller clinics. And I don't claim to know about this, but what I'm hearing is that there's a problem with a clinic potentially, accepting some kind of insurance, and the insurance company may have a relationship with a certain hospital system. And eventually they, make a proposal to buy the clinic. And then before you know it, all these small clinics are ending up being owned by these big outside
Yes.
companies. And that's too bad.
It is. I know a number of physician-owned clinics and practices that have been approached by some of these larger private equity-owned companies. The company says, we want to buy you out, and the practice says no. And they say, okay, well, if you don't sell to us, we're going to starve you because we'll prevent patients from you seeing patients, we'll prevent insurance from covering those visits. And so eventually the practice has to sell because they're going to close up. And what happens is those practices are gobbled up. One of the solutions that the trial lawyers are proposing to really bring doctors here, and there's a number of solutions that we can talk about, but one of them is help physicians incentivize them to come to the state by helping them start their practices. I told you at the beginning of this interview, my stepfather practiced in San Miguel. He had his own clinic, his own practice. It's expensive to start a practice. You got to buy equipment, you got to pay your staff, and there's always a delay. You see 30 patients a day, you don't collect on that from insurance for 30 days, 40 days, even longer sometimes. So it's expensive to get that going. One of the solutions we're proposing is let's find ways for tax incentives and tax breaks for young doctors, not even young doctors, doctors and their families to come here, and we'll help them start their clinics. We give them tax incentives to do so. But that only works if we can also prevent the back end issue that we just talked about, which is private equity companies coming in and trying to quash those clinics or just buy them up and close them down. It doesn't do any good to help 10 doctors start their clinics if 7 of them get bought up by private equity and close within the next 5 years. Okay. Other solutions that we have, when my stepfather graduated medical school, he could have gone to Phoenix, he could have gone to Denver, he could have gone to Dallas and made good money in those markets. Okay. But he really wanted to come back to his home in San Miguel in Las Vegas and provide medical care to an underserved area. But he had $250,000 in medical student loan debt. Okay. That's not just the cost of starting the clinic. That's just from what he paid for student loans. So a lot of physicians who are getting out of medical school and out of their residency are wanting to come and practice, but they have this burdening debt. And I think it's a great idea to say, come practice in New Mexico, because this is actually what happened with my stepfather. Come practice here, commit to 10 years of practice or whatever the time would be, and the state will help pay those loans down. Okay. We've got lots of money in this state. Lots of it. Sometimes I've talked to legislators. They're saying, we're looking for places to spend this money, the right places to spend it. That is the right place to spend it. Help bring doctors here and say, let's help you with your student loan debt. Let's help you with starting your practices. We need to address education in this state. We need to have schools that doctors will want to send their children to. We need to address crime in this state. This is a multifactorial issue. The solution is not more caps that further limit people's rights to get into court. That's not the solution. If we think that somehow stopping people's access to courts and justice will solve this issue, we're kidding ourselves. We're going to still have this problem, and then we're going to have a lot of people with no rights, no justice left to go for them to seek.
That raises so many issues. I have a million more questions to ask you. Yeah. One of the interesting things, I recently had lunch with an expert who's a physician, and he was explaining to me just how reimbursement rates work. And I didn't realize this, but apparently hospitals are able to negotiate certain, big corporate companies. They're able to negotiate these high reimbursement rates, but the small or independent clinics don't necessarily have that power. Someone who's getting paid $300 a visit for a particular thing in Albuquerque, maybe an equally qualified doctor in a really rural area is only getting paid $100 for the exact same care. And I said, how is that fair? And how can we sort of equalize that a little bit more? Because especially if the fear is, we don't really know what's going to happen with Medicare, Medicaid. I saw recently that, our state is going to try to shore up Medicaid dollars to make sure that people don't lose their insurance. There's a lot of stuff going on at the federal level, but it seems to me profoundly unfair if doctors are not being paid, commensurate with their skill and the same service that they're providing as their urban colleagues.
Yes.
Yeah. So
because what does that do? When we know right away, it incentivizes leaving rural areas and moving to the urban area because you're going to make more money, and we don't want that effect. We want people staying in Deming and Raton and providing care in Tierra Amarilla and rural areas. But if you're going to pay more money to practice in the big city, what are people going to do? They're going to move to where more money is.
It would be lovely to see a rule or something that would require a little more equalization and fairness, especially if that is what we're concerned about are the providers in the rural areas. Because, I have family in a rural area, and when my dad needs medical care, he's got to drive an hour to get medical care. There are some options where he is, but he feels like medical care options are better if he travels. And that goes back to exactly what you were saying.
When you're talking about reimbursement, one of the other big issues that many doctors have told me, I know of doctors right now who live in this state, but practice in Arizona, Colorado, and Texas. Why? They will tell you the reason is gross receipts tax. By practicing across the state line, they automatically get a 7 to 8% raise right off the bat. And when you're talking about the reimbursement rates, if Medicare reimburses, let's use $100, they reimburse $100 for a patient care to a physician. Right off the bat of that $100, $8 goes to gross receipts tax. So they're already losing 8%. And there's been many proposals to try to carve out or create exception for healthcare providers for gross receipts tax. To me, it's a no-brainer, Feliz. I think that that's something that we can do right away. But what I find up at the Roundhouse is that some people, particularly local governments, don't want to lose the gross receipts tax revenue. So that really good idea that I think everyone agrees is, and right away, an 8% raise for our providers to accept them out of gross receipts tax, that ends up dying up at the Roundhouse because local governments don't want to give up that revenue source. Anyone listening, make calls to your representatives about this, because I think right off the bat, the gross receipts tax should be an easy fix to some of this problem.
Maybe the insurance company should pay for the gross receipts tax, right? I suspect that New Mexico doctors have lower reimbursement rates than, for example, Colorado doctors, just because the cost of living is higher. But shouldn't the gross receipts tax be one of the factors that's accounted for in the reimbursement rate? I mean, maybe that's not the way it works, but it just seems unfair. And it seems like a really important factor that doesn't really have anything to do with lawyers or malpractice.
And it's one that I know from all sides of the aisles, right? Within the Democratic Party, within the Republican Party, most everyone I talk to are like, why can't we just do that to help them right away? That's not going to solve all the problems, but right away it's going to solve an 8% income problem. And
Sure.
they,
That's significant.
yeah. The other thing is that we talked about these private equity owned companies, and they really dictate the practice of medicine, as do insurance companies. And we've got to get away from this state in particular, allowing insurance companies to dictate the practice of medicine. The practice of medicine, tests are run on somebody, what examinations are done should be a decision between the patient and their provider, period. It should not be some insurance company representative in some other state saying, no, no, doctor in New Mexico, I don't think you should do that for this patient. And that's a source of a lot of frustration. And private equity companies do that too. And how they do it is they cut corners, they cut staffing because private equity is about and driving revenue and driving profit and lowering costs, right? We know in any area, it doesn't matter if it's medicine, manufacturing, pharma, all these things. If you cut corners by cutting costs, you're going to have bad results. You're going to have
Yeah.
basically an unsafe product that goes into your community.
In every single one of my cases that involve any kind of healthcare, the issue, I mean, 9 times out of 10, if not more, often boils down to whether there's an appropriate staff and in
Right.
terms of numbers. And there's all often issues about whether there's been appropriate training and policies and procedures, but this even just bare numbers
Mhm.
are a really big deal. And I worry about that because not just for patient outcomes, but although I think this science shows that there's a direct correlation between staffing levels and patient outcomes.
The harder
But
stuff. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
but I also worry that if our hospitals or larger clinics, or for whatever reason, there are incentives for doctors to have to limit their time with a patient to 15 minutes or whatever, that's really
Mhm.
hard. And that creates, I think, burden and stress on them. And I get it, plenty of members of the public need doctors and need to see care, and they're trying to see as many as possible. But I think we want to see our doctors, nurses, all healthcare staff having appropriate support and not
Mhm.
getting burned out.
Yep.
Because, frankly, that works for lawyers too. It works for all professions. If the demand on your time and your expertise is too much, the outcomes are not going to be great.
I said this before in one of these other interviews that I've had. It's healthcare in this state and across the country in a lot of ways because of private equity has turned into kind of assembly line medicine. And assembly
Yeah.
line might work really well when you're building trucks and cars. It does not work well in medicine because you have your own unique medical needs as opposed to what I need. And Jane Doe or Susan over here, we all have our different medical needs. And to put doctors in a position that's unattainable, frankly, to say you're going to practice medicine in this time slot and see this amount of patients, it just doesn't work. It puts an undue strain on the system. It puts it on
Yeah.
our providers. Last week, I was watching some representatives from a rural hospital that was talking about medical malpractice being the fault of all their financial problems. They were testifying to the Health Human Services Committee, the House Health and Human Services Committee. And during the testimony, it came out that this rural hospital is actually managed by a private equity run management company out of state. They pay them something like $30,000 a month to manage them. And they use this term, I wrote it down. They said, because they were asked, were there any layoffs after this private equity company took over? Well, we had some right sizing done. Right sizing? I said, right sizing? I kind of wrote that down and went and looked it up. It's a fancy term for being fired. That's what it is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I would imagine that those people who got right sized at this hospital don't consider it right sizing. I think they tell people, I got fired, I got laid off.
Yeah.
And that is what happens when you have a buy, strip, and flip approach is you come in, you buy it, you strip down the costs, you try
Yeah.
to drive up revenue so you can sell it. And that is going to kill our rural healthcare. It is going to kill it. It's not a question of whether it's just going to be limited in New Mexico. We know nationally it is killing our rural healthcare.
We want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by the New Mexico Trial Lawyers Association Alliance for Justice. We want to thank our Adobe Pillar supporters, Fadul, Clough, Hardy, and Conaway, LLC, Poulos and Coates, and Tani, Acosta, and Chaparro, PC. Through their generous investments, they're safeguarding New Mexicans' right to access justice and a jury. Now, back to our conversation.
There was a question. I thought it was really appropriate. It was a little bit, it felt like it was it was a good question. And yet, I think, like, when I heard it, my internal response was, in this political climate, are you kidding? He said, why can't we? Let me think about exactly how he said it. He said, why can't we have no fault insurance so that people can get care? And I was like, okay, I mean, sure, because we're not Denmark, I guess, is the answer. And
Is that basically no, like kind of like no pre-existing condition kind of thing?
I think so, but I'm
Yeah.
not sure exactly.
Yeah.
And I can only speculate, but I just thought because there's this and I formulated an answer in my own mind, but I was not the person he was asking. So I went to school in Las Vegas too. And so I have a bunch of friends from all around the world. I went to the World College and I have had different people from other countries ask me, like, why are lawsuits such a big thing? Why are healthcare lawsuits such a big thing in the US? And I had to think about it. And I mean, I don't really know the answer, but I suspect that part of the answer is because healthcare is so expensive and so hard to access. And I've got a case right now that I'm working on where a lady had just really serious surgery, and then her insurance company denied her access to care, and we don't know why. And that's a big, big, big problem. And I'm just like, maybe we would have fewer lawsuits if if it wasn't so hard to access healthcare. And I'm not just talking about a doctor shortage, because I don't necessarily, I think per capita, we're doing pretty well. We may have fewer doctors in our state, but we're also not as populated as other states. So it's so hard to access care. And even when you have great health insurance, because there's the prior authorization process, there's the denials. And, I know other people, tons of people who are like, oh, I'm taking this stupid medication and it's making me sick and I hate the side effects, but my insurance won't pay for the better medicine.
Yeah. No, that goes back to my point is we've got to stop allowing insurance companies to dictate medicine. We have to
Yeah.
and dictate what they're going to cover, to dictate how frequently you're going to see your provider. People go in to wait months to see their provider because they're waiting for a prior authorization from an insurance company.
Right. And I could see the danger. I'm trying to envision what is the counter argument, right? And I think the counter argument against just like mandating that healthcare that's ordered by your doctor is covered, I think the counter argument that I can think of is, well, what happens if, for example, pharmaceutical companies are, just trying to doing kickbacks and stuff, because that happens. And this expert I was talking to, we were just not talking about any particular case, just making small talk. And he said, what if the rule was that insurance companies had to cover doctor ordered healthcare as long as that doctor had no financial interest in that company. In other words, the doctor could
Right.
order rehabilitation at a facility as long as he didn't have any ownership interest or any kickbacks from the
Yeah.
rehabilitation. And that makes sense to me. And he made another really good point. And he said, if you're a doctor and you're relying on pharmaceutical reps to take you to dinner, you've got a problem.
You're right. Yeah. Well, no, look, I mean, yeah, I think there's going to always be in any area, whether it's law, medicine, accounting, there's going to be some of those bad apples that take advantage and try to game the
Sure.
system and do stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great segue to this issue about punitive damages that we're hearing a lot right now. And we've got to
Yeah.
cap punitives. Punitives are out of control.
Let me tell you what I'm hearing, and I'm not sure. I mean, I know what the answer is, but what I keep hearing is that effectively there are no caps because punitive damages are not off the table. And let me say more about what else I'm hearing is that so if there's a $2 million cap or whatever, that's meaningless if the judges allow punitive damages to go to the jury.
Mhm.
And not only that, but here's another thing I was hearing is that, and this gets to the point about whether people really understand about our obligations as lawyers. And I'm not sure that the audience got a really satisfying explanation about this at that town hall, but is it unethical for a lawyer to put in the complaint, make a claim for punitive damages, unless it's something that's just like horrific? And I have my own ideas, and I'll start sketching it out. And then I think you have more experience and your insight is more valuable than mine on this particular subject. But I was explaining to someone, I said, well, my understanding of punitive damages is really different. It's not unethical. And part of the need and for it is not to be mean to people who may have made a mistake. And I want to come back to that point because I think that's another conversation. But also, insurance companies have so much power over how a lawsuit proceeds. And very often, the doctor is not made part of the conversation about settlement or offers to settle. It's not really the doctor's business, it's the insurance company driving that discussion. But one way of allowing an individual doctor to be part of that discussion is to have that concept of punitive damages to allow them to say, hey, if you don't accept this offer to settle the case within the policy, I'm exposed. And then therefore, so please, it's a way for giving the doctor an opportunity to go to the insurance company and say, don't screw me over. If there's a reasonable settlement within the policy, please do that. So tell me if that's true. And the other thing is, I think the punitive damages part, first of all, I think experiences are mixed when it comes to judges allowing punitive damages to go to the jury. I think most judges that I've gone to trial in front of have eliminated punitive damages. And it's fine. In my mind, makes it an appellate issue if I think it's strong enough.
I mean,
But
that's
I
part
think
of
it's
what their role
rare.
is. Right. And that's part of what the judge's role is. And that's what I think
Yeah.
that's a very good point to really start with is that we have to remember that if you pass a law that says we're going to put a blanket cap on punitive damages, that means for every case, every circumstance, no exception. Okay.
Yeah.
And what I want to get into is some examples of why it's dangerous to do blanket caps on things, especially when
Yes.
you're talking about punitives. But we also have to remember we have judges who are very good. We have some of the best judges in the country in this state, some of the smartest judges. They're all lawyers. They all have practice. They all see cases that come before them. They are charged with, do I let certain things go to the jury, like punitive damages or even certain claims, or not? They sit through a trial and they hear the evidence too. They hear it with the jury. I think when we talk about attacking punitive verdicts, this is my feeling. I think it is an affront to the judicial and to the juries that sit on these cases. I think it, and what I mean by that for our listeners is I think it's an offensive statement to make to our jurors. Why? Jurors are made up from people from all of our communities. If
And
you,
it's a rigorous
yeah,
process to pick a jury.
what I think is we're asking ourselves the wrong question. The question we're asking that's not the right question. And we're saying, oh, why are these outrageous juries coming back with these punitive damage awards when they should be asking, what are the people in my community that serve as jurors, what are they seeing in these trials that is causing them to say $15 million, $40 million in punitive damages? Because remember, our system is set up so that jurors are the eyes and the ears of our communities. They watch our communities and they help keep our communities safe. So now let's talk about punitive damages. You're right. Punitive damages are extremely rare. There's a higher burden of proof. You have to show more evidence for punitive damages than you would for any other claim like compensatory damages or lost earnings, that kind of thing. You have to show that really the person on the other side or the hospital, the corporation, had a kind of a malicious or culpable mental state, we call it, as you know. But for the listeners, what does that mean? Basically, you have to just show that it wasn't just an accident, that they did things that were particularly dangerous, that were particularly dismissive, that were particularly ignorant of the person's safety and their health. And usually, if somebody dies in a very bad way, you're going to have an argument that there might be punitive damages here. And the jury's given these jury instructions at a trial, and they said, look at all this evidence, be objective, don't bring your personal biases in. We want you to be objective and fair. And they say, now, when you're considering punitive damages are awarded for the limited purpose of this. And this is the important part: to punish and deter future conduct. The and deter part is so important because what it is basically, it's a message from the jurors that make up their community saying, don't come to our community and act recklessly. Don't come. What's the great example that we know of that everyone around this country knows? The opioids. Big Pharma saturated our communities with opioids.
Yeah.
They did it, we know now, they did it knowing that it would cause destruction to families.
And they made a ton of money.
They made billions of dollars doing it. And what our communities, the jurors in our communities, when they saw the evidence, they said, I don't want that junk here in my community. I don't want that culpable mental state here in my community. And they send messages to say, don't do this. And the only way you get $1 billion corporation's attention is that you hit them with an amount that's going to actually affect their pocketbook. If you take a company that makes $8 billion a year and say, I'm going to award $25,000, do you think that company is going to do the right thing and say, okay, well, we're going to stop, acting recklessly? No, because $25,000, it's nothing.
And let me ask you this. You've been practicing for about 20 years. You've handled a bunch of medical malpractice cases and trials. How many times in your legal career have you gone to trial and had a jury award punitive damages?
One time. Just
Me?
once. Yeah.
No, 0 times.
One time, and it was a case that it was a cover-up that involved text messages and involved doctors texting each other to try to not tell the patient about something terrible that had happened. And the jurors saw that, and understandably, they got very upset about that. And they said, no, don't do that here.
There's a case that got a lot of attention that a lot of people are talking about, and 400 million and blah blah blah. And I don't know that case intimately or the details of it, but based on the sketch that I've heard, that jury basically decided that that was a company that was just awful. I don't think that those healthcare providers could fairly be compared to good, awesome healthcare providers, and that was a company and it wasn't so much against the doctor, it was against a company and a business model that needed to be put out of business because they were deliberately taking advantage of really vulnerable people.
And they were doing it under the guise of the facade of we're practicing medicine, and they really were engaging in serious fraud, from what I understand, that was going on.
Yeah, and then they went ahead and declared bankruptcy.
Going back to the point about punitives and blanket caps, is when we talk about the example of Big Pharma, the public has to keep this in mind. When you talk about capping and a blanket cap, as opposed to letting courts decide on a case-by-case issue, when Big Pharma comes in and flood your community with opioids. Under the proposal that's being proposed to cap it, Big Pharma would have a cap too. They would get that benefit of it too, because again, there's no exception. You're making a blanket cap. Whereas our system that we have now, judges and jurors get to decide based on each individual case. And like you said when you started, you took a case to trial, and the jurors in that community said, no, I don't think this doctor did anything wrong. If you take away the power of the jury to hold multi-billion-dollar companies accountable for their conduct, every one of the listeners out there, you know this. If you take away accountability,
Yeah.
are the companies going to do the right thing, or are they going to continue doing things like cutting corners?
Right, right. Another issue that I heard come up at that meeting that made me realize that there's just so much disinformation out there is the woman was complaining about how lawyers get the benefit, and oh, these rich lawyers are making money and their poor clients continue to suffer. And she was saying that with respect to paying future meds.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to expand on that just a little bit more because this relates to actually a question that a reporter asked me. She said, well, why do trial lawyers do what they do, and why do they take medical malpractice cases if it's not just to get rich?
No.
And I just it was such a wild question. And that's maybe, I know she didn't actually ask me in that way, but that was the vibe I got from, or, from her question. And I just thought, oh my God. And so I'll tell you a little bit of a story or a couple of anecdotes from my experience. And that case that I took to trial, I knew it was going to be a really hard case. And it was long, long, long time ago. And this is all a matter of public record. And I've talked to my client about sharing this story, for the purpose of just educating people, and that's fine. And that's another interesting point, right? Because we have to be, as lawyers, we have an ethical obligation to be really careful about talking about our clients and telling their stories. And we're allowed to tell their stories in judicial proceedings, but they're either because of the rules of ethics or because of non-disclosure agreements that we've signed or that our clients have signed when they've settled cases, it's not always easy for us to be able to go out and tell our clients' stories. But in any event, I knew that this case was going to be really hard. And in fact, I tried to get some other colleagues to join me on the case, and everybody was like, no, thank you. But I loved my client so much. He was so determined, and I just really, really felt for him. At one point, the public should know that in the vast majority of cases, the parties are ordered to participate in mediation. And this mediation, our final offer was, we will settle the case for $0. I will waive all my fees and costs in this case. At that point, I probably had about $25,000 into it, mostly in expert witness fees. And I said, all I want from my client is for his future medical care to be covered. And I said, I'm not even asking for an amount to cover it. I'm not even saying, let's put $20,000 or $200,000 in a pot for him to have future medical care. I said, I'm just saying you need to cover it when he needs it.
He needs it. Right. Yeah.
And they said no.
Yeah. Yeah. No, they look.
And I didn't do that because, listen, and I did that because I was raised with a very strong sense of my obligation and duty to do community service. And I do a lot of community service. It makes me feel good to do community service. That's why I became a lawyer, is because I want to do good in the world. And I realize that it's complicated. But I also have a family, and I have bills to pay, and I work hard, and I'm a business person, and I try to be a good business person. So I think it's fine for people to make money. But what I wanted to bring up is this woman saying, no, lawyers should not be making money on future meds. The other anecdote I wanted to raise is that in my role, I'm often a guardian ad litem. And what that means is that when there is a child or a disabled adult and there's a settlement, I get hired to review the terms of settlement for fairness and to also make recommendations about how to not exactly manage the money, but I make recommendations about other people managing the money just to make sure that it's safe and available. And sometimes I get involved in these cases at mediation. And even though I don't handle a lot of medical malpractice cases in my practice right now, when I'm a guardian ad litem attending mediation in one of these cases, my experience for years has been that lawyers don't get paid for negotiating for future medical care for their clients. And it
Yeah.
may have been that at some point in the past, they could negotiate a lump sum, and that actually protected the patient compensation fund because then what they ever had to pay was capped. And it
Yeah,
was,
it was all done. Yeah, it was done. I hear it too. I've heard the arguments in the public from primarily insurance companies or
Mhm.
representative insurance companies saying lawyers get rich from doing this. And whether you're in civil rights and medical malpractice and criminal law, anything like that, your first and foremost obligation ethically and loyally is to your client and your client's best interest. There are cases that I could go to trial and I know I'd get a lot of money because the facts are so bad. But I also have to think about is it good for my client to go try a case? And what's the best thing for my client and nobody else? And we make our decisions based off of that. When people come to me, they have lost the primary breadwinner. I know a family member in his early 50s, construction company. He owned a construction company. He was the sole breadwinner for the family. Children, wife, I think he took care of his mother-in-laws, and father-in-law, and went in for a small procedure at a hospital and died. And he died because of medical malpractice. Okay. And at 51 or 52, however old he was, that's it. He was the
Yeah,
company. The company was done.
yeah,
The family had no other source of income. Sometimes they go in and they have medical malpractice and they don't die, but they are severely injured. They can't work anymore, and they're the sole
right.
breadwinners. So the importance of future medical care, future earnings, all those things, we as the lawyers, our job to work that up, we have to go prove that to the jury. The defendant doesn't have to prove that. In fact, their whole role really is kind of trying to disprove it or knock it all down. We have to
Yeah,
show the jury why the future medical care is needed, how much it will cost, oftentimes to the dollar. We have a report. We have to go hire experts. For the listeners out there who may not know, there's physiatrists, there's rehab medicine specialists. They know what it costs generally to take care of a patient maybe who has a brain injury or something like that from medical malpractice. And so they say, well, over the course of this person's life, they were expected to live this long. Here's how much it will cost daily to take care of them. What I'm talking about are people who are 24/7 dependent on care. Okay. And sometimes they're children, sometimes they're adults, they're a spouse. And we have to go prove that up. We have to hire these people. We have to get the reports done. These are very expensive. You have to talk to all the healthcare providers involved in that patient's care and get the information from them. Because the last thing we want to do is go to a jury and say, well, it might be this, it might be that. We're not really sure. The jury will say, get out of here. What are you here for
Mm,
if you don't have this information? So you go there to show the jury it came from their doctor, it came from their nurse, it came from this person here, and this is what it will cost. Well, the defendants say, well, the lawyer shouldn't take any money from that. Okay, that's fine. I will tell the public this. Some people don't take money for that. Some of the lawyers don't do it. They do that as a cost to prove their client's case, but they don't take money for it. Some might take a percentage of the money from it. But remember, we had to work it up and prove it and get that information because the insurance companies never will come forward with saying, oh, here's how much we think that it will cost. And if they do, it's going to be far less than what it will
yeah,
actually cost. We are about accountability. The trial lawyers are about holding people accountable. And what that means is accountable for future medical care, accountable for lost earnings, all of those things. And we have to prove it. We would not be very good lawyers if we only proved half of it or only proved a
yeah,
quarter of it. We have to go
yeah.
prove it all. I don't think it's fair but I understand, hey, look, they're going to make their accusations. I think in response to those accusations, I like to talk in facts and reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the fact is, when you commit malpractice, oftentimes in the cases I take, it's a catastrophic consequence. People have lost everything because of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And even in my practice, I mean, it kills me to say this. I wish that I didn't have to, and I think in some ways, I'm really fortunate that I've gotten to the stage of my career where I can decide what cases to accept or not. And I find myself telling people, I'm so sorry this happened to you. When I take a case, I put my business's finances on the line. We advance all the costs, and experts are not cheap. And by the way, that's an important point to note that the public may not know. We're required to have experts in the vast majority of cases, especially in medical. If the allegation is that a doctor messed up, the requirement for us to even get past the initial stage is to have another doctor willing to testify the doctor there was a breach in the standard of care. So that's important. And I think a lot of doctors, experts are, my experience anyway, is that they're not willing to go out on the line. Maybe there are some out there that I've not met yet, but in my experience, they're very conservative. And I hear them say, well, no, I can see why you would think that that would be a problem, but don't worry about that. That's actually okay. But here's what I do see, and here's what I am willing to testify about. And I appreciate that because that's their job, is to educate me about what I need to know. It's really collaborative, or at least that's the way I like for it to be in my office.
Yeah,
But it's an important procedural hurdle that a plaintiff has to have, is to bring that medical expert to say this person did something wrong, or the hospital did something wrong, or something like that. But anyway, I feel like I've already
yeah.
lost my train of thought here, but
No, if you,
pick it
you're
up.
exactly right. The public should know that. We hear a lot about frivolous and medical malpractice lawsuits. I imagine there's a few out there. I agree.
Yeah.
I will tell you, if you are a medical malpractice lawyer and you don't have an expert to support your case, you're not going to have a case for very long. The
No,
judge will get rid of
you
your,
won't get to trial.
yeah, you won't get to trial. The judge will get rid of your case, probably in the middle of it. You're going to lose a lot of money litigating that case. If I say out of 50 phone calls of potential medical malpractice cases, I get a lot of phone calls from them. One or two of them are a case that
Yeah.
I am willing to go forward with. Sometimes I see bad medical care in those cases, but I don't know that it's in the best interest of the client's time to go forward with a lawsuit. You know,
Right.
I oftentimes turn away cases that I'm like, well, this is probably medical malpractice, but for whatever reason, and there are a number of variables, it's not a case that I can take on for you, and I'm going to
Yeah.
put my time into working for, because these go, as you know, a year, 2 years, 3 years, even. When we went through
Yeah.
COVID, I had cases that were 4 years out. So you spend a lot of time, a lot of hours on these cases, but you're exactly right. If you don't know what you're doing in medical malpractice and you try to bring, quote, a frivolous med mal lawsuit, you're going to go broke very quickly. You're going to lose your practice very quickly because your case is going to go away. You're not going
Yeah.
to have any result for your client. And as a
Yeah.
lawyer, that does no good for your client.
Yeah.
Financially, it's hard on you, but imagine what your client through. So
Yeah.
I always kind of start with, again, what's in the best interest of my client here? And is it really good for them to go forward with a
Yeah.
case like this?
Often the answer is no. And I tell people, I'm so sorry. We just, especially these days, we really have to. Actually, I think one of our colleagues raised this issue, like, oh, should we only take the bigger cases, and shouldn't we occasionally take a smaller case? And the answer is it really depends. Like, it
Yes.
depends. I need to feel, when I take a case, I need to feel like I'm doing some good for someone. And it doesn't have to be catastrophic injury, but I feel like there has to be something about it, something special about it, that makes me feel like I can sort of give back to the community or whatever.
Right.
And the reality is there are not enough hours in the day for lawyers to accept every case where there has been a breach in the standard of care. We have to be picky about it.
Yeah, because it doesn't do your client much good to know that, well, I'm taking this case. I kind of think it's maybe a close call. My client's such a nice person. I don't want to tell them no. Because at the end of the day, you end up hurting your client a lot more.
Oh my God. Yeah.
You
It's
sometimes you just have to tell them what they need to hear. And you know what I have found when I do that?
yeah.
They appreciate that. They're like,
Yeah.
hey, thank you for telling me this. By the way, I
Right.
will tell you with medical malpractice, I cannot count how many times I've had patients, clients come in where something awful's happened to them. I mean, they've had a stroke and it's been really bad as a result of medical malpractice. And so many of them say, I wish somebody would have just said, I'm sorry.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
and I think there was a medical study about this like 10 years ago that one of the medical publications came out with a study that said they have found that most people won't even sue for medical malpractice if the provider says, I messed up, I apologize, and I'm going to do what I can to help you through this now. Oftentimes, where what gets patients very upset and gets them to a lawyer is that they've had medical malpractice happen and like doctors or hospitals didn't tell them or try to cover it up or didn't
Or just
acknowledge it.
stop talking to them
Right. Or just,
and
yeah,
then sent
completely
them
cut
a
them off,
bill.
ghosted them in medicine, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
and that is a good way to have a patient. If any medical providers are out there listening,
Yeah.
insurance companies will tell you, don't say anything, don't admit you're wrong. But sometimes, and more often than not, telling a patient, hey, you know what? I am so sorry this has happened to you. Even if you didn't do something wrong and you're not admitting you did it wrong, acknowledging them, being sympathetic and saying, look, you know what? I don't know what happened here. I don't know what went wrong, but we're going to help you through this and try to figure out how we can help you. Patients just want to hear that.
That
Yeah.
is so true. So true. And they want, I mean, I think a lot of them, have difficulties that money would help address. But I also feel like, especially if a death has happened, I think families want to know that something meaningful has happened as a result, maybe a policy change
Yes.
or someone saying, okay, fine, we've implemented this policy because we see the danger of doing things a certain way.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
I think people would be I think the vast majority of my clients would be thrilled by that, in part because those are the kind of clients that I like to sign up, are the people who are really motivated to like do something good and not just cranky, and they want something meaningful to happen.
It's not infrequent when I get clients that tell me, I just don't want this happening to another family. I
Yeah,
want this process or this policy to change so that
right.
no one ever has to go through what I've gone through.
Yeah,
And people out there, I continue to believe, whatever side of the political aisle you fall on, I really believe that people out there, the vast majority of them, have good in their heart and really
yeah,
just want to be able to help the people in their communities. And when they've gone through a death where they've lost a loved one, they're heartbroken, they're distraught. And oftentimes, I think that the truth that comes out from them is that I don't want this happening to somebody else. I don't want someone
yeah,
else going through this pain. I find that to be out of a very sad circumstances, something very beautiful as people have for the love of their fellow human and fellow man or woman is that I don't want people in my community going through this. And we saw that with opioids, by the way. The communities were shattered, and everyone in their community was like, someone down the street lost their son, or someone one of my friends at work lost their mother. And the communities came together and said, I don't want this anymore for our community. I think there's a lot that we can still dive into. I really had a good time. And I really think that, if I leave a thought with the listeners out there, is let's try to find the right solutions to this issue. We all
yeah,
agree that there's a healthcare shortage in the state across the country. I think the disagreement comes down to what is causing it. I want to find solutions that really fix it and that really actually have effective results for our communities. And as a lawyer, I don't believe that cutting people's rights off, cutting their access to justice. And what I mean by that is blanket caps, making it harder to try to find attorneys because you say attorneys aren't supposed to, or you can't take certain cases or this kind of stuff. That is not going to solve the problem. We're still going to have medical malpractice. We're just going to have people who have been harmed that don't have access to the courts anymore. what we need to do, let's start at the beginning of the storyline that prevents the harm that happens. I would love to not have to work as a malpractice lawyer anymore to say, hey, you know what? Suddenly we don't have malpractice anymore. Nobody's losing their loved ones. Fine, I'll find another way to make a living. We can
Estate planning.
Yeah, we can solve these problems with doctor shortage, with patient frustration, and it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be at the cost of losing your access to courts. Again, what trial lawyers stand for.
I agree. And I would love to work with doctors to try to get to the bottom of what is going on with these insurance companies. I
Yeah.
think we all deserve better answers. And
Certainly
I
more
think,
transparency. Yeah.
yeah, and I think the insurance companies have this really effective divide and conquer strategy that's unfortunately working. And I think we need to recognize that. And I can see why a lot of doctors would be mad. But I hope that my dream, if I can dream, it's that we can work together to get to the bottom of what's going on with the insurance companies.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time. As my closing question, what is your favorite New Mexico meal or day trip?
Oh man, can I do both? Can I tell?
Yeah,
You
do
decide which
both.
one you like better. So my favorite New Mexico meal, I love Duran's Central Pharmacy, and they have today, in fact, on Mondays, the chicken tamale special with green chili, and then I get it smothered with red chili. Can't go wrong.
Love it.
But that's, and then the favorite New Mexico day trip, actually taking a trip to the hat I'm wearing here. I think going to Santa Fe for the day. I love Santa Fe. I think the weather is always beautiful there, no matter what time of year you go. The food is always really good, by the way. There's great New Mexican food in Santa Fe. I think it's the perfect day trip. And, to get out, walk around, see the arts, see the shops, eat the food, enjoy the weather.
That is so awesome. I know, I love it because you get to eat good food and then kind of walk off the calories.
Right. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
guilt-free.
Yeah. No, and there's always people playing music in the plaza with their guitars or their whatever the instrument they're having. And I've actually picked up a guitar there with somebody and we started playing together. It's just
That
it's
is
a really fun
so
place to be.
great.
Yeah.
I love it.
So,
Cid, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate your time and your knowledge and experience. Just really appreciate it. Thank
hey,
you.
thanks for having me.
Before we wrap up, we want to thank our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by the New Mexico Trial Lawyers Association Alliance for Justice. We want to thank our Chili Circle supporters, the Tracy Law Firm, and Curtis & Company. Through their generous investments, they're safeguarding New Mexicans' right to access justice and a jury.
Thanks for joining us on New Mexico Legal Lowdown. If today's conversation changed how you see the legal system, share it with a friend. We'll be back next time with another trial lawyer fighting for New Mexicans. Produced and powered by LawPods.